welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Yo.
Hey.
Hello, hello. Today we are continuing our discussion of Abdulrazak Gurnah's Paradise, the last book in our series Rich Country, Poor Country. Today's discussion may contain spoilers. We previously posted a spoiler-free review episode. You can find that one in our archives. If you would like to chat with us, you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod.
This book has a bit of history of confusing some Western critics. There are a number who have compared it to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, such as Johann Jacobs, who went so far as to say that Gurnah is kind of following in the footsteps of Conrad, that Gurnah is portraying a kind of backward new version of that earlier journey. But while I think that's possible, it also feels very simplistic. It's a journey into the Congo, but I don't think there are that many similarities beyond that. Other critics like James Hodapp have pointed out how Eurocentric that is, and I won't reiterate all his points except to say that he says there is plenty of evidence of the non-European influence in Paradise. I looked up the Yusuf chapter of the Quran, and honestly, it seemed kind of dumb that Conrad would be the first thing someone would point to, considering how many parallels there are to the other Yusuf, as some of the characters call him. In fact, much of this story mirrors the accounts of Joseph or Yusuf, who is a figure or prophet of the book of Genesis and the Quran, respectively. So my question is, why might Gurnah do that? Is this a retelling? It's obviously not the first time that has been done in a novel. But when we compare this with other novels we've read with religious subtext or allegory, I think it's easier to see the reason for that use of religion behind those. So I'm thinking of, for example, a children's Bible or Parable of the Sower or Signs Preceding the End of the World. So what does he gain by rooting his character in this older account?
So I didn't know much about the tale of Yusuf, the Quran version of the story, before reading this book. So it seems, after reading about what that story is, it seems like it is very clearly a retelling. Would you two agree?
The parallels are very strong. If you know where to look, it's kind of obvious.
Right. He's always described as, handsome in the book, and Yusuf is supposedly a very handsome man.
Other names are the same or similar.
Right, Aziz.
Suleja.
There is that story in the Quran about him being accused of some impropriety with the wife, right? And then there's that story about his shirt being torn from the back. I mean, you can't get more explicit than that, I think.
Right. There are other parallels, but yeah, that seems pretty exact. So is this just a retelling? Do you think, the whole purpose behind that?
I would say no, because, well, he does belong to a non-African tradition. Yusuf, the character in the story, is African. So it is a merger of this kind of foreign literary or religious character with an indigenous African. And that, to me, I think is substantial, coming from somebody who is very similar to that in his own personal, identity. Gurnah is African, but he is of Arab descent.
Does using such a framework help translate any ideas beyond that similarity more effectively for a particular audience? Is it just what you said, that this is kind of translating that story for an African audience, or does it help him do some other legwork?
I mean, it's very tough to say, because I don't know if this is something that's meant for me as a Western reader. Although I can't really say that Gurnah had a Tanzanian reader in mind, it seems like he's calling on two separate traditions that don't include us.
Yeah, I agree, because I'm not conversant in the Quran, and all I know about the story is what I've read online, over the span of half an hour or something. So the difficulty is, how can we ascribe any significance to this if, as Iad said, we are not perhaps the target audience?
I guess what I'm curious about is with those other books I mentioned, with a children's Bible, Parable of the Sower, Signs Preceding the End of the World, it wasn't just retellings. It felt like there was more going on. And I think there is more going on with this book, but if it is largely a retelling, and you're right, we're not conversant in Islamic tradition, so a lot of this is speculation. But why go to this length to give these exact parallels, but hide it in the ways that it's hidden?
I think what I could say to that is that it's clear from the broadest perspective that Yusuf in Islam is a revered person, somebody with a lot of very positive features, but also somebody endowed with the gift of prophecy. He could see things that normal people could not. In the context of the novel, it could be said that Yusuf is the opposite of a prophet because he seems very unaware of things. He doesn't understand his situation in the world, but perhaps at the end of the novel, with the arrival of the soldiers, he has his first prophecy. That's one way of thinking about it. Again, it's, I think, calling on to traditions that don't necessarily belong to us. There are parallels that can be drawn. I think there is another aspect too, though. I want to kind of take you to task a little bit, Sam. You had some harsh words for Mr. Jacobs for comparing this novel to Heart of Darkness, but I don't think that's entirely fair.
I don't think it's entirely fair in that Heart of Darkness is, to use a familiar word, canonized in literature, especially Western literature. So it's hard to escape certain figures like Conrad, especially this kind of iconic journey into the heart of darkness.
Oh, that's what it means.
They're going into the same place. And I can see the argument that Gurnah is kind of doing the reverse because it's the opposite direction. They're moving in from the east side, whereas Conrad's characters are coming from the west side. But that seems like such a simplified way of looking at it.
When Jacobs makes this Conrad interpretation, it doesn't mean that he didn't see the Yusuf interpretation. It just means that he's not talking about it, right? The way I see it, it's not an interpretive problem, it's a disciplinary problem. Now, I don't know Jacobs, but if he is a scholar of English literature rather than a scholar of Arabic literature or a scholar of Islam, wouldn't it make more sense that the things that he writes about professionally have to do with English literature?
This is a slight leap, but it's to assume that all writers of Eastern descent are writing from a Western standpoint, or that all Eastern writing has to echo back to some Western tradition is a bit of an overstep, I think.
I don't think he is saying that. I think what you're pushing for is kind of a definitive interpretation where this is the interpretation and it must be true. I don't know if that's what's really going on. I think that, especially with post-colonial writing, they draw on identities that are very mixed. And for you to say you have to get the correct interpretation out of it would require the critic to have the same mixture of identities, right? And that's just very difficult. Now, Gurnah's identity as Tanzanian, and now he's lived in Britain for like 50 years. That's pretty common, I would suppose. But what about somebody who was like a mixture of Thai and Tanzanian, and he used both influences in his writing? Nobody could interpret that kind of work.
I think my take is fairly mild, which is that we're trying to figure out the intertextuality here because there are a lot of ways to understand this book, and it's not very preachy, unlike the previous books we read. So we're looking for different ways to intersect with this book. And I think that's what Johann Jacobs is trying to do, is like he's looking for a way to intersect with this book. I think there are a lot of different ways you can look for how this book might latch on to another book and what kind of relationships that might form. And I don't think it needs to be mutually exclusive. But I think the difficulty is because his background is so uncommon for us. We don't read a lot of Tanzanian writers, especially of Arabic descent. It's hard for us to find that link. if we circle back to what we were saying about the Quran, like, what can we say about it? Not much, because we don't come from that background. So we can't make that intertextual connection, or at least a meaningful intertextual connection or understanding.
I want to just say this is a point in favor of Gurnah's prose and in favor of his storytelling. This is potentially a very substantial aspect of the novel that we weren't really aware of when we were reading, yet in my understanding of the novel, I don't feel like something is missing. I feel like the text is rich enough and interesting enough as it is, and knowing about these things would make it just even more so.
I agree with that. I think that's one of the reasons why this intrigues me, is because I don't know what it's doing for the text, but it sounds like we can't fully answer that. One of the other things that I really enjoyed about this novel is how Gurnah reveals information to us that may change how a reader views or is supposed to view Yusuf and the people around him. What I want to know is, what does that slow reveal actually do for you as a reader? Does your view of Yusuf's life station change over the course of the novel? For example, do you think of him as a slave or as something else? We talked a little bit about that in a previous episode, I believe, the differences between indentured servitude and slavery, but I feel like it's kind of blurred here. What do you guys think?
I think what's interesting to me is, over the course of the novel, there are moments where you feel like he's powerless, especially when there are these kind of threats of sexual violence against him. And you feel like, okay, I mean, he doesn't have any way of getting away from the sexual violence. If someone were to rape him, like on this trip, like there's not much he could do about it. But at the same time, there are moments in the book where he seems pretty empowered. And I don't know if this is a one-way movement, where he goes from being more of a slave or more of a servant to being more empowered. I mean, overall, I'd say probably, because he's maturing and he's realizing the kind of influence he might have on other people. But I don't think it's so black and white. Like, I don't think the book is him realizing that he is not a slave, for example. In fact, it might be the opposite. I think the realization is that he is somehow imprisoned.
I think that it's very important that we as readers come to understand his situation at the same time that he does. I think that that's the experience for me that really makes the novel. That's the most important part of the experience. And at the beginning of the novel, the negative significance of his situation living with Aziz is not as pronounced as it could have been. I was actually open to thinking of this as a kind of hero's journey, where his maybe mixed parentage or his uncertain origins, just because he's not living with his parents after he moves with Aziz, might make him more heroic than tragic. And it seems to be that he has this experience with Aziz that is pushing him towards something much grander rather than a life of servitude.
There are a few moments where his view, and I suppose our view of his position, seem to rock back and forth. When Khalil early on says that Aziz buys anything except slaves, you're led to think that, okay, we're not supposed to think of him as a slave. But later, those lines get blurred by Aziz himself. And when Khalil makes it more clear what Khalil is doing with Aziz and the fact that his sister Amina is imprisoned there. But even before that, there's a moment when they're on the journey. I think it's late in the journey. They're on their way back and everyone feels really defeated. There's this moment when Yusuf is thinking about Khalil, and he's thinking about what bondage means, what it means to be shackled. And he says, or he thinks, "For a start, he ain't your uncle." He thought of Khalil and smiled despite the gloom and the sudden sense of self-pity he felt. That was how he would become if he kept his wits. Like Khalil, nervous and combative, hemmed in from all sides and dependent, stranded in the middle of nowhere. And then he goes on a little bit and says, like Kalasinga, 1,000 miles from home, like all of them stuck in one smelly place or another. even though we haven't figured out at that point just how much of a nothing he is to Aziz, even if we suspect that by that point Aziz might be raising him to be his second in command, even then he's starting to see the threads and starting to see that his life doesn't really mean a whole lot independent of Aziz.
I think that Khalil being in the novel is important, though. It shows us Yusuf because Khalil is kind of a foil for him. Why is Yusuf's situation different from Khalil's situation?
I think partly because of personality. And I think there's something to the way we don't know too much how Khalil looks other than he's, I think, very skinny. But Yusuf is constantly called pretty, like he's this very attractive boy. And I feel like that is what creates that sense of unease that you talked about throughout the book, but it's also what saves him throughout the book. That prettiness, that complete handsomeness is kind of what keeps him untouched by people that might do him harm.
I think that's part of it, but if we go back to this idea of him being potentially a prophet or having access to something more, there is something that people see in him that makes them know that he is no ordinary slave or no ordinary servant.
So that's what I was starting to get at with the personality, is that there are different parts where other characters ascribe those kinds of things to him, whether it's there or not. For example, we may have even brought it up because I feel like we marked a lot of the same passages. There's a moment on the journey when Muhammad Abdullah is speaking to Yusuf and says something like, "You can see everything. You always have your eyes open." And it's a little bit ironic because with his eyes open, he sees things that Muhammad probably should and doesn't, especially about their master Aziz. But yeah, other characters constantly bring that up, that he either is like the other Yusuf or that he may be like the other Yusuf. They kind of revere him for qualities that he either has or that they put on him or that he might have just because of how, you say naive, but maybe just quiet he is, that he's just always observing. When he's with Khalil, he's asking a lot of questions, especially when he's young. But when he's on the journey, he's silent. He's just watchful.
One way of looking at his character and the book as a whole, which I don't know if it's entirely valid, but to think of him as a vessel. Like, the question I would ask is, what is he to these other characters in the book? I mean, you talked about how other people see him, but I think he is important to other people in different ways too. Everyone seems to want to be around him. For example, for Aziz's wife, he's a point of lust, I guess, but also someone who potentially could cure her disfigurement. He's the love interest of a few ladies. He's like a brother to Khalil, because, Khalil, I would say, is someone who's quite lonely because he's entrapped and he sees someone else in the same situation as him. And when he begins to transgress, Khalil can't accept it because Khalil himself cannot transgress in the same manner because it's his adopted sister. An interesting question is what he means to Aziz, because that is the most opaque, I think. Because at the beginning, you don't really know why. Like, is it because Aziz is like a perv? Like, is that why? That question was in the front of my mind for the first 1/4 of the book. Like, is he being groomed sexually? Because we don't know. Like, we don't know what Aziz's reputation is. We don't know why he has this house that he's not allowed to go into. So the question, what he is and why he's important to other people, I think is one way of understanding this book. Because he's a lot of things to a lot of people. So he's kind of like a vessel. People place their own desires onto him. And of course, as a vessel, a prophet is a vessel for God.
Yeah, before we close here, I wanted to twist a little bit of what you brought up earlier. You mentioned that Gurnah is writing from two different cultures simultaneously, and possibly even a third, that he is of Arab descent, but he's Tanzanian, and that he's spent much of his life, including where he is now, in Britain. So who do you think is the audience either that he's writing for or the audience that might get the most out of this book?
This reminds me a lot of the kind of ideas that Nguyen brought to the Sympathizer that we read last time, where he talks about how a minority writer often feels the need to translate or pander. I think that Gurnah is avoiding the same thing. He is not translating or pandering to the majority. He is expressing his unique hybridity. And I think that's the kind of empowering thing that a lot of minority or mixed race authors are going to be doing in the future. That said, it becomes very opaque to people who don't have that same hybridity. When people don't have the same references, they end up like us. So I think what this means for novels in general is they are going to become more and more opaque. And as readers, we're just going to have to live with that.
Do you think we suffer from that, though? You said earlier that you didn't feel it was necessary for this book, that we didn't have a deep root in Islamic studies, for example.
Well, it depends how inquisitive you are, how curious you are. Like, I knew something was going on, but I couldn't access it. And that's frustrating, right? Like, you want to understand everything that there is to be understood. So, to that end, it will be difficult in the future if you read a book written by somebody who is Colombian and Japanese. And you're like, oh, I know he's saying something about Colombia, but I don't know what it means. But I think in the future, that's what's going to happen to readers. You're not going to have every book that you see in the market referring to the Bible. It's not going to be all of these references to Job. It's going to be something else.
Is that much of an issue? I suppose it depends on the book and it depends on the depth of the reference. But let's just suppose that most books end up being like this, and our relationship to those books end up being like our relationship to this. Is it that much of an issue?
Well, I think Iad said this earlier. Like, having a book where you don't understand everything isn't to the book's detriment, because it means the book has layers where if you want to understand more, you can try, to understand it more. I think the difficulty is that it would automatically weed out books that are not successful on a storytelling level. Because if you have something that needs to survive because of its intertextuality and you don't understand the reference, which leaves you frustrated, then that book won't be successful. But that probably means it's not a very good book. Like, it might have good ideas, but it might not be a good novel or story. Sure, like, that might be a possible detriment. But on the other hand, books that succeed, where you don't understand the intertextual references, those books are even stronger because that kind of mystery that leaves you wanting to know more, that's a positive thing. Because I think reading a book and understanding everything is not really desirable. You want a book that by the time you finish, you want to kind of know more. You feel like the author has more to say, or the author has given you just a glance at a universe that is deep or profound or textured or full of importance. Just like how we understand the world, we never fully understand the world.
I think the difference for me is in terms of the experience and not the book. The books themselves can still be wonderful, but what matters to me is whether or not the reading experience is frustrating or enticing. And with this book, if you encounter this allusion to Yusuf in the Quran and you can't understand who he is and why he is important, that is very potentially frustrating for a lot of readers. And there is something beneficial in the reading experience of understanding what the ideas are and how they're being used. And that richness of the experience is enjoyable, but I think it comes at the cost of forcing non Anglo European writers into the dominant paradigm of these are the references that you can make, and this is the cultural touchstone that you can point to. That to me, I think, is an unfair burden to put on them, but it gives us certain benefits.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our understanding of the book, you can let us know on Reddit. You can find us there at our Canonical Pod. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. We'll be back next week with more in-depth discussion of Paradise. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.